This is the last week in a series of talks where I'm looking at some of the verses that are used to make following Jesus seem harder than it really is. And today I want to look at Romans 6, verse 1, where Paul asks a question: should we continue to sin so that we can experience more of God's wonderful grace? And sometimes this verse is used against me to suggest that I abuse God's grace. I misuse God's grace, and I use it as permission to sin, to get away with living however I want. And that's not the case. I do try to live a good life. I do try to live a moral life. I just own the fact that I fail in this all the time. And in those instances, I'm so thankful that God's grace is sufficient. That while I fail God, God in God's grace will never fail me. And that's going to be the dynamic of my relationship with God until the day I die. So Paul asks this question in Romans 6, verse 1, should we continue to sin so that we can experience more of God's wonderful grace? Because he knows that's the conclusion many of his readers are going to make based on what they've just read in Romans 5, specifically in verse 20, where Paul says, where sin abounds, grace superabounds. What Paul is trying to explain is that our sin will never outpace God's grace, that we will never out-sin God's grace, that I'll never sin so much or so big that I've exceeded the limits of God's grace. So no matter how often I sin, no matter how big I sin, there's more than enough grace there for me. And so Paul asks this question because he knows his readers are going to ask that question. Should we continue to sin then so we get to experience more of God's wonderful grace? And the answer is obviously no. But the fact of the matter is that we are all going to continue to sin, no matter how much we try not to. In spite of our best efforts not to, or in spite of our best efforts to resist sin, we are all going to fall down, we're all going to fail, and we're all going to continue to sin. Even the people who ask this question about me. Paul explains this in the next chapter, and he uses himself as an example, that even though he tries his very best, he continues to sin. And if Paul finds himself in this position, certainly we're all going to find ourselves in this position as well, and be forever dependent on God's goodness and God's grace to abound even when our sin abounds. So should we continue to sin so that we might experience more of God's amazing grace? The answer is no, but the truth is that you will experience more of God's amazing grace when you sin. So like John Calvin said, we can sin boldly, and it's not permission to sin, it's simply reminding us of the fact that Paul makes so clear in these chapters of Romans that when we do sin, we don't have to worry that we've out-sinned God's love for us, we've out-sinned God's ability to forgive us, that we've out-sinned the measures of God's grace for us, because we just never will. That while we may fail God, and we will fail God, God and his grace are never going to fail you.